Happy Wednesday! You're listening to Mama Murdered a Podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, we're covering a much easier case than what we've been covering the last few weeks. This one's a lot lighter, a lot less murdery. Actually, nobody gets murdered, so that's always a plus. And it's also a case that comes straight from my childhood. I lived literally a stone's throw away from where this case happened, and I heard about it my entire life. Like all throughout my childhood, this was a case that was talked about. This week, we're covering the case of the Loomis Fargo heist out of North Carolina, and this was the second largest heist in American history. And it was all done by a couple of rednecks. So without further ado, let's get it. This case even inspired a big Hollywood hit called The Mastermind. No, I'm sorry, it was just Mastermind. And I swear this movie makes you wonder if these people were really that dumb. And sadly, a lot of the movie was based on fact. So, yay for North Carolina idiots. And if you haven't watched Mastermind, you should. It is hilarious. It's so dumb that you would think that they made a lot of it up. Sadly, the first quarter or so of the movie is based on actual events. Now, the rest of the movie is kind of like a comedy movie. It's made for TV, which I think makes it even funnier because then I wonder if everybody in North Carolina just talks like that, like the way they make it sound on the movie. And I'm like, oh no, surely not. And then I go through these episodes every week as I edit, and I realize that yes, in fact, we do all sound that country, hillbilly, redneck, hick. It is who we are. So I'm learning to be okay with that. And apparently you guys don't mind it too bad. So, now this case is straight out of North Carolina, and I did grow up in North Carolina. I only live the next state over in South Carolina now, and I really don't think the way that we speak in North Carolina is that much different from South Carolina. So it seems like no matter where I go, I'll just always sound very hick-like, if you will. And I've accepted that and moved on with my life. So let's talk about David Gantt. In 1997, David was the kind of he was the man, the myth, the legend after he pulled off this heist. Just like myself, David grew up in North Carolina. That's also known as the gas house to locals who grew up there. And that's where I was born and raised. And it seems like David grew up doing a lot of the same things that I did as a kid. He drove up and waited for somebody to come out to his car to order an Ro's barbecue sandwich with the infamous Ro's barbecue slaw. He ate the best ice cream on earth at Tony's Ice Cream. He drank choice drinks and cheer wine and cherry lemon sundrop. And I'm here to tell you, nothing hits the soul quite like those North Carolina drinks do. And if I were guessing, David probably eat a lot of Niece's liver mush on 2 pieces of loaf bread. He was a typical North Carolina guy. And like most typical North Carolina guys, David was overworked and underpaid. Then again, so was everybody else working at the Loomis Fargo plant. This was like a huge warehouse where the employees were paid next to nothing to guard and protect millions of dollars that were stored there. And I actually saw that David was being paid about $8.15 an hour working at the Loomis Fargo warehouse, like where the money was stored. And David may have lived in North Carolina, but he, like most people, had to make the short trek to Charlotte every day for work. It's not that long of a drive, and a lot of the times the pay is a lot better. David worked as a vault supervisor at the Loomis Fargo warehouse. This warehouse is where money's stored that goes into a huge armored trucks. Those armored trucks get filled to the brim with money and then driven around to different banks and then distributed for the public to get out of the ATM machines and cash withdrawals when they go to the bank. So you would think that it would have been a pretty secure place, like secured better than Fort Knox. But we later find out that it was actually pretty easy to clear every single bill out of this Loomis Fargo warehouse. David was a married man, and he was married to a woman by the name of Tammy. And the couple had racked up some pretty substantial credit card debt that caused them to live paycheck to paycheck. They had to watch what they spent and account for every single cent that they had to their names. They lived a very normal, typical, lower to middle class lifestyle, just like everybody else in North Carolina. David worked every extra shift he could get his hands on. And some weeks he would work anywhere from 70 to 80 hours a week, which is a lot of overtime, but it's also a lot of time away from home. And even with the extra shifts and overtime, it was nowhere near enough to cover the couple's debt. David had worked, and their debt seemed to be staying about the same, which is why y'all don't get credit cards. You borrow it, and it takes years and years to pay back because of interest. And It's a trick. Just don't get credit cards. I promise they're a trick. David had been honorably discharged from the military, and he had no criminal background whatsoever, which I would imagine that it would be kind of hard to get a job as an armored truck driver, or even a job in a warehouse where millions of dollars are stored if you did have a criminal background. David and his co-workers had kind of hypothetically joked about how they would rob the warehouse for all the money if they ever got ballsy enough to try it. And in some interviews that I watched, people that worked at this warehouse seemed to always talk about like how easily or how hard it would be to rob the warehouse, and it seemed to be like the biggest running joke between all the employees there. So it wasn't just like one guy joking about robbing the whole vault. Literally everybody would joke about it on a day-to-day basis. But if anybody would be able to steal that much money and get away with it, it would be the people that worked in the warehouse. They would know the ins and outs, the best days, the best times. They'd know when fewer people would be around. They'd know exactly when, what, and how to pull off a heist. If someone decided to do it, hypothetically, of course. And for a long time, these were just that. Hypothetical jokes, hypothetical plans between coworkers. A way to blow off steam and talk shit about something that none of them thought would ever actually be a plan. Until one day, they weren't just joking about it anymore. One of these coworkers that David would joke with was a woman by the name of Kelly Campbell. And David got to where he was kind of sweet on Kelly. Kelly was the opposite kind of woman to the kind of woman that David was married to. David's wife, Tammy, would complain about David smoking inside their trailer, and from what it seemed like to me, she just nagged and nagged about like any and everything. And Kelly seemed to be a nice change of pace for David. Even though it was no secret that David was a married man, he still openly flirted with Kelly in front of everybody at work. And I want to say that Kelly was also married. It may have not been the best marriage, but she was married. So she's not just some single cutie, she's also a married woman. So neither Kelly or David are single, so I'm not really sure how they thought this plan would work. But Kelly didn't work at the Loomis Fargo warehouse for very long. She had moved on to different employment opportunities, but she and David kept in touch. And it was one day at a cookout when Kelly was talking to a guy she had gone to high school with named Steve Chambers. She and Steve got to talking about, how they might be able to pull off this huge heist and, completely rob this warehouse blind. And it was at this cookout that the plan kind of came to fruition and became more than just hypothetical chit-chat. Steve and Kelly got to talking about the Loomis Fargo warehouse and how they might be able to get away with robbing it, because obviously Kelly knew that Steve had to have been involved in some kind of shady shit, because neither Steve or his wife Michelle had a steady job, but they also seemed to have more money than everybody else who worked steadily. And Steve was kind of known around town for being like a low-grade crook. He was known for loan sharking and gambling, and he had passed off around $30,000 worth of bad checks. Steve really thought he was smarter than what he was, though. And Steve was sure that he could pull this heist off, and that they could all walk away scot-free. They would get away with it, and he just knew it. So Kelly Campbell brought it up to Steve that she had an old coworker that still worked at the Loomis Fargo plant. And Kelly thought that David might be interested in helping him out and kind of being their inside guy. Kelly knew that David was the warehouse supervisor, and she knew that David would have the keys to the vault. And David and Kelly had already joked about robbing the vault before, but Steve was kind of the planner. He kind of liked to be in charge. And though Kelly and Steve had talked about this for a while, before Kelly actually brought the finished plan idea to David's attention, and this one is, there's a lot of names, but there's really only 3 main players. If you can keep up with them, it's a really, really good, funny story. So the plan was simple. David would be the gang's inside guy. Steve would be the mastermind behind the plan. He would be the brains. And Kelly would be the sweet piece of ass at the end of this risky plan, as far as David was concerned. So Kelly took the idea that she and Steve had devised, and she took it to David one day. And David had come into like a breaking point in his life anyways. David had kind of calculated how long it would take he and his wife Tammy to pay off all their credit card debts. And even if they made the minimum payment every month on time, it would still take the couple years and years and years to pay back the debt that they had collected together. And with David's recent realization about his debt that he and his wife Tammy shared and how long it would take to clear that debt, David said that this is when the idea didn't seem like such a fantasy anymore. David said, quote, "Prior to, I would have never even considered it. But one day, life just kind of slapped me in the face. I was working sometimes 75 to 80 hours a week for $8.15 an hour. I didn't have a real home life because I was never there. I was working all the time and unhappy, which is understandable considering how old I was at the time. I felt cornered, and one day, the joking in the break room about robbing the place suddenly didn't seem so far-fetched." So, David's thinking about it now. And it wouldn't be long before all three of the major players of this plan to rob the Loomis Fargo warehouse were all on board. The plan was simple. David would somehow create an opportunity to be left alone in the warehouse where the money was stored, and he would do this during one of his closing shifts on the weekend because that's when less people would be on the clock and around to see what was going on. That would mean less people are there at the warehouse where the money is. That would mean less people are asking questions and getting in the way. So once David devised a plan to get himself alone in the warehouse, he would then load the money up into one of Loomis Fargo's own company vans and he'd simply drive off. And then they'd all be filthy rich for the rest of their natural-born lives. David had even kind of studied how the police and FBI would look for him, and he even knew about how long they would keep teams of people looking for him as well. So David kind of knew what he needed to do. He knew that after the first few years that the resources used to catch him would kind of dwindle down, and then after that it would be maybe one or two guys looking for him. He also knew that as long as nobody went on any crazy spending sprees, that they'd all be clear at the end of the spectrum too on that end. David knew that police would do whatever they needed to in order to retrieve the stolen money, so David had a plan for that too. And he'd planned to take off south of the border and head to Mexico. He would leave his wife and his life behind, just for a few years at least, and then he'd come back when the heat wasn't so hot. So he was just going to wait until there really weren't that many people looking for him anymore and then come back home. And then David would get his cut of the money once everything was less watched and less studied. And until then, he'd just live off smaller amounts of money that Kelly and Steve would send him in Mexico. And then once the coast was clear, David would collect his millions that he was owed. And he was the only one that was going to be doing any heavy lifting. So this is the only way that David could really make the plan make sense for him. So how could David make this plan work? Well, if David took the money during his closing shift, then no one would even realize the money was missing for at least 12 hours after it was taken. Because someone new wouldn't clock in for at least 12 hours after his last shift had ended. So 12 hours would be a pretty good head start on the police. And I'm going to go ahead and say this here. David was under the impression that he and Kelly were going to do this heist, go ahead and get it over with. And then David believed that Kelly had plans to meet up with him in Mexico once the heat died down some, and then the two of them could live happily ever after in Mexico. But Kelly denies that she ever led David on. She denies the fact that, that David believed that this was what was going to happen after the heist. She had never planned or told David that she'd planned to meet him in Mexico. And Kelly will die on that hill that she never led David on and that this was never the plan. But that's clearly a lie because later on during the investigation, there are multiple pages sent to David's pager from Kelly that were a code that said 143. And this was code for I love you. So Kelly's sending I love you text to David's pager. So this code 143, the number 1 is, there's only one letter in the word I. The number 4 is for the 4 letters in the word love. And the number 3 is for the 3 letters in the word you. Hence, 143 on a pager code would be I love you. So take that how you will. She had to have been leading him on. There's no other way that would make sense. And I just wanted to go ahead and throw that in there now because there's usually some kind of love interest in a situation like this, and this case is no different. So David's plan now is in place, and he knows the role that he'll play in the heist. He also knows the role that Kelly and Steve are supposed to play. And he knows everybody's role during the heist and after the heist is over. So everybody knew exactly what they were expected to do and what they were supposed to do afterwards. And this plan didn't just happen overnight. Kelly first asked David how he would rob the Loomis Fargo warehouse if he were ever going to. Hypothetically, of course. And then it was weeks and possibly even months before Kelly brought the idea to David's attention again. But once Kelly brought it up again, David had already discovered how long it would take to clear his credit card debts, and eventually David was persuaded to be the main guy in the Loomis Fargo heist of 1997. And he'd do it with the help of Kelly Campbell and Steve Chambers. And it was on a Sunday on October 4th, 1997, that David went into work for his normal shift at the Loomis Fargo warehouse. But what David didn't know was when he got to work, that he would be training a new employee that day. And this would actually kind of work in David's favor later during his shift. And this was the shift that he was planning to rob the warehouse on, so it just kind of worked out. So David training this new guy would actually end up working in David's favor later on. David went about the day of the heist and the day before the heist, just like every other normal day. David had made himself a dentist appointment, he had gone to the grocery store with his wife, he had helped to put groceries away, and he had gone to work, just as if he was a man who was planning to return home when his shift was over. But he wasn't, not this time. Today was going to be anything but a normal day at the office for David. And on David's way to work, it was like God was talking through the radio speakers to David when the song Take the Money and Run started playing on the local radio station as David drove himself to work. And this was the sign that he needed. Take the money and run, David. Take the money and run. So David went to work and he trained this new employee, just like he'd been asked to. And it seems like David was just biding his time until it got closer to time for the warehouse to be closed and then locked down for the night. David watched as each employee left to clock out for their shift and they headed home for the night. And eventually, the only two people left in the warehouse full of money was David and this new coworker that David had been training. And David went through the closing procedure, showing the new trainee exactly what to do and exactly how to close the warehouse up for the night. And after David showed this new trainee all of the normal closing procedures, David told this guy that he could go ahead and go home, that, David would finish closing up. It had been a long day for this trainee, and since the guy was new and just training, he had no idea that there was always supposed to be more than one employee in the warehouse during their closing shift at all times. This was both for security reasons and safety. And David even walked the trainee out the door of the warehouse and watched as his headlights pulled away from the Loomis Fargo plant. And just as soon as David was alone in the warehouse with all that money, the plan was a go. Take the money and run, David. It was on like Donkey Kong, son. David used a Loomis Fargo van, and he started loading money into it. He had meticulously chosen a van that was full of gas, and he'd kind of even messed around with the electric switch on the locks so that he would be able to crank the van without having to worry about the electric locks. David had even gone so far as to check the oil and maintenance on this van earlier in the day to make sure that it was the one that he wanted to use for the heist. David knew that the quickest way for him to get caught would be for him to be caught on CCTV security cameras, and those were all around the inside of the Loomis warehouse. Now, it was 1997, so the cameras recorded on VHS tapes inside of a VCR player. And if you don't know what a VCR or VHS is, then you're probably too young for this podcast, and you should probably go to bed now. You have school in the morning. So David made sure that he took both of the VHS tapes out of the security system so that he wouldn't be recorded stealing millions of dollars. And he took both of those VHS tapes with him once he was ready to leave with the van full of money. After David made sure to cover his tracks of not being caught and making sure the cameras were good and that the money was gone, David pulled out in the van that he had meticulously chosen, and he loaded every last bill that was inside of that money storage warehouse into the back of a Loomis Fargo company van. All the money that was inside the vault that David took weighed somewhere around the 2,000 or 3,000 pound mark, and it ended up being more than $17.3 million. David had loaded every single dollar and every single stack of cash by hand and by himself into a company van. It took David a couple of hours to load up all this cash, partly because it was a shit ton of money and partly because he was loading it all by himself. David said that he'd even thought about it earlier in the day, that if he was going to risk taking one single bill out of that warehouse, that he may as well go ahead and take every single bill inside the warehouse, because whether it was one bill or thousands of bills, it was all going to be the same criminal charge. And so that's exactly what he did. David loaded more than $17 million into a Loomis Fargo company van. The bills were mostly 20s and 50s, but there were also 1s, 5s, 10s, whatever. But it was mostly 20s. And people often say things like, oh, that's a ton of money. But in this case, this was literally more than a ton of money. Like, weighed more than a ton in the most literal way. And what VHS tapes wouldn't have caught on camera was David doing a little shimmy on his way out the door while he stacked the last little bit of cash into the back of the company van. He did a little happy dance on his way to load the last few stacks of cash. He had basically gotten away with the perfect crime. He wouldn't be caught on security cameras. He was a good, reliable employee with no criminal background. No one would ever suspect little old David Gantt of Gastonia, North Carolina, pulling off one of the largest cash heists in American history. Except that he did. He had did the damn thing. Well, kinda, but we'll get there. And after David had gotten all $17.3 million loaded up and into the back of the van, and after he'd done his little victory dance, David grabbed every key that he could find in the entire warehouse and he threw them all in a box. This was hundreds of keys. And I'm thinking he probably did this in hopes that it would take police longer to get into the vault to notice the money was missing. But that part was over. He'd gotten the money. So David drove off to meet up with Kelly Campbell and Steve Chambers to hand off the money. Because they weren't stupid. They knew that David would be a person of interest, especially after the new trainee would have to let everybody know that he had left David alone in the warehouse the night before. Steve Chambers had also enlisted the help of another local man by the name of Eric Payne. And Eric's job would be just to help Steve take the money out of the Loomis van and move it to a more secure location while Kelly helped David flee to Mexico. And for this, Eric would also get a cut of the Loomis money. So David and his crew had a plan for this. Like I alluded to before, the plan was for David to haul ass and head straight to Mexico. He was going to lay low, and Steve Chambers and Kelly Campbell would just send or wire David smaller amounts of money when he needed it to live on. $20,000 here, $10,000 here, no biggie, right? And then, of course, once the heat died down, then David would come back and collect the rest of his cut of the money when the coast was clear, and then he and Kelly would live in Mexico together happily ever after. Because David fully believed that Kelly was going to join him in Mexico at a later date to be determined. So David meets up with Kelly and Steve, and he hands off damn near every cent that he had just stolen. David knew that he wasn't going to be able to take multiple millions of dollars out of the country without the help of somebody who police wouldn't be looking at. So David had only planned to take about $50,000 with him into Mexico to live on for a while. David had also given the box of keys that he'd stolen from the Loomis Fargo warehouse to Steve and Eric, and then he'd separately given them the key to unlock the automatic locking doors on the armored truck, because the doors on the armored truck locked automatically. Not like a normal car where you have to lock them yourself. The doors lock every time the doors are open and closed. And David had even meticulously chosen to take only $50,000 with him to Mexico, because apparently at the time in 1997, you could take up to $50,000 worth of cash with you across the border without having to answer any kind of hard questions. So that's the amount that David took to start his new life in Mexico. $50,000 in today's money in American dollars right now would be somewhere around $94,000. So that's not chump change by any means. And at this handoff of the money between David and Steve, this was actually the first time that the two had ever met one another. It was a quick exchange. David gave Steve the key to the truck that he'd need to unload the money, and apparently either Eric or Steve one had just thrown the truck key into the box of other keys, not really thinking that they would need those keys again after they'd met up with David. And this was the only key that would lock and unlock the doors on the truck that was filled with millions of dollars. But this box of keys also had hundreds of other keys in it as well. So David collects his little $50,000, and he and Kelly headed out for the airport. They're going to get a plane ticket to Mexico, while Steve and Eric would move the money from the Loomis Fargo van into their own personal vehicles and into like a rented U-Haul truck or budget truck. But think about that. David had stolen enough money that they legitimately needed a moving truck to fit the money in once they had gotten it out of the armored truck that David arrived in. That is an insane amount of money. But also, David had already done the heavy lifting. He had stolen the $17 million. And Steve and Kelly couldn't even line him up a plane ticket to get out of town? Come on now, that's kind of messed up. So Steve Chambers and Eric Payne would later end up leaving over $3 million worth of $5 bills and $1 bills inside of the Loomis Fargo truck because they either couldn't fit it into the truck that they had rented or they didn't feel like they had time to load it. But regardless of why they left it, they left $3 million inside of a stolen armored truck for the FBI to find later. Come on now. These are not the brightest crayons in the bunch. And one thing David didn't really think about, it seems like he had kind of thought of everything, but he didn't really think about how he would be able to get $50,000 that he was planning to take with him onto an airline without being suspicious. I mean, you can't really just pack it up in a bag and, haul it around with you. But that was something they'd have to figure out later. Because after they'd passed off the rest of the money on to Steve and Eric, Kelly drove David to the airport in Colombia to get his airline ticket to Mexico. But first they needed to figure out a way to sneak the $50,000 into Mexico without raising eyebrows. So Kelly pulls out some pantyhose and some duct tape, and she helps David conceal the money inside of the pantyhose so that he would be able to board the plane. David had money taped around his underwear, his waistband, he had money shoved down in his boots, he had money crammed in every crevice of his body. Now, granted, this was long before the 9/11 attack, so airport security was nowhere near as strict. But still, this was a lot of money, and David wouldn't be able to just stick $50,000 worth of stolen money into a carry-on bag without somebody wanting some answers. When David and Kelly arrived at the airport, they're told that this airline doesn't offer flights straight to Mexico. The airline staff tells David that their best bet would be to try the airport in Atlanta, that they may be able to get a flight straight to Mexico from Atlanta. So that's David's next stop. David had to get on a Greyhound bus and ride to Atlanta in order to get a plane ticket to even get to Mexico. So now David's just chilling, riding public transportation with his entire body covered in stolen money. So he's just chilling on a Greyhound bus with more than $50,000 in stolen cash. I guess you never really know who you're sitting beside. Meanwhile, David's learning that he's not going to be able to get a ticket for the airport that's close by. That's not going to work because they don't offer the flight straight to Mexico. So while David's learning that, Steve and his buddy Eric are loading this money onto the moving trucks when they somehow let the armored truck doors get locked from the inside. Steve and Eric tried to pry the doors open, and I would imagine that they were probably beating the shit out of the windows and trying anything in order to get back into the armored truck where the remaining money was. But this was a literal armored truck with bulletproof glass made to withstand damn near anything. So that box of keys that David had left them, the box with hundreds of keys in it, yeah, that box. One of the men had thrown the truck keys into the box, and in order to get back into the armored truck, Steve and Eric would have to go through each and every key in that box in order to figure out which one would unlock the doors. And I guess they were so nervous and anxious that they actually bypassed the right key for the truck once and had to go through each individual key again until they were able to find the one to unlock the truck doors. And then there's something that we don't find out until much later on, and that's that the Loomis Fargo Security Company had actually requested that the Mecklenburg County Police Department just start riding by the warehouse a few times a night just to check on things and make sure, nothing was out of order. And as David was driving this Loomis Fargo van out of the parking lot with $17 million in the back of it, he actually passed one of those Mecklenburg County officers. And David's asshole had to pucker up so tight when he passed a police officer. But David did the universal southern wave and the head nod. The officer did the same thing, and the two drove right past each other. Of course, nobody knew that there was even any money missing at this point, but David's nerves had to have been a wreck at this point. Especially since this was a much later normal time than any armored truck would be expected to be out on the road riding around. But the officer didn't think a thing about it, and they drove off. So now David's in Atlanta, and he's got a plane ticket to New Orleans. Once he gets to New Orleans, he'll be able to fly straight to Cancun, Mexico. So David's got money strapped to every part of his body in places that it probably shouldn't be, and this part of the plane goes off like a hitch. David finally makes it to Mexico, and when he arrives, he ate all the nicest foods, he stayed in the nicest rooms, he went scuba diving and deep-sea fishing. David was living his absolute best life in Mexico. And of course, even with David having a pretty good chunk of money, that money wasn't going to last forever, And especially with the expensive foods and excursions, the money wasn't lasting as long as he'd thought. And David was just kind of waiting and biding time on Kelly to meet up with him in Mexico. Again, he thought they were going to go live happily ever after. David even says that he had to adjust to not buying everything from Walmart. Like, he didn't have a budget. He bought what he wanted, when he wanted it, and however much of it he wanted. He was living his redneck dream. Steve and Eric eventually get all the money loaded up into 55-gallon drums, and it seems like Steve and his wife Michelle were kind of storing the money anywhere and everywhere they could fit dollar bills at. But a lot of the money was stored at Steve's house, and throughout this entire thing, Steve has control of damn near every dollar that David had stolen. So now we're rolling into the next morning, and by now, police have been alerted on two different things. One is that David's wife, Tammy, had placed a call to report that David had never returned home from his shift at work. And at about this same time, Loomis Fargo and company is starting to realize that something isn't right at their warehouse. The CCTV cameras have obviously been tampered with, along with every key in the building is now missing. And it was less than 48 hours after the heist that a grand jury convened and an indictment was issued for David Gantt. And I'll explain how they got that indictment in just a second. So there was really, police and David's own wife Tammy wondered if maybe David had been robbed and locked in the vault, or maybe, he had been forced into taking this money, because this was just totally out of character for David. And since David had taken damn near every key in the building, police wondered if, maybe he wasn't locked inside the vault. The Loomis Fargo and company had to break into their own vault, and when they finally got the door opened, they realized that there was not so much as a single dollar bill left inside. There was also no David anywhere in the vault either. But David had acted so normally in the days leading up to the heist that David's wife Tammy was convinced that he had either been forced to take the money or that he had been kidnapped. And police weren't really convinced that David had taken the money on his own either. Like I said, they weren't sure if maybe somebody had forced him to take it. And now that Tammy's saying that he never came home, police don't even know if David's still alive or not, or if he had been, forced to take the money and then killed later. No one really believed that David would pull this off, especially, with his record. He was a stand-up guy. So their next step would be to check the Loomis Fargo warehouse, and they see that the 2 VHS tapes are missing from the CCTV camera system. But there's one camera that David didn't really know about, and when police hit play on the VCR to play the only tape in the warehouse left, everybody's jaws were on the floor when they saw David Gantt just nonchalantly loading millions of dollars into the back of a Loomis truck. So David had even kind of thought that he was covering his ass by taking the 2 VCR tapes that he knew about. But there was one that he didn't know about, and since he didn't know about it, he didn't take it. And then the little dancing jig at the end maybe kind of wasn't his brightest idea, since he had forgotten that one tape. David's personal truck was found soon after the single tape was discovered, and inside of his truck was his wedding ring. Nobody really knew if this was David's way of, giving the middle finger to his old life, or if maybe it was something else, like him leaving a sign that he was alive. So between what they had already found, that's how they were able to get the indictment. It only took 2 days after the heist that the FBI was alerted by a man cutting grass that he had found the missing Loomis Fargo truck. The truck was found less than 10 miles from the Loomis Fargo warehouse by the man cutting grass, and the FBI would pull up on the scene to find $3 million that Steve and Eric had left in the bag. But that's not all they found inside the armored truck either. Those 2 VHS tapes that David had taken from the warehouse were also found inside of the armored truck. And I don't know if Steve and Eric did this on purpose or if it was purely mistake. But when we learn a few things later on about Steve, I think y'all are all going to agree with me that Steve and Eric probably left these on purpose. And probably as a way to, purposely point the finger at David and nobody else. But I'll let you make your own assumptions. Now the police know that the money's missing, and they also know that David's missing, and thanks to David and Steve and Eric, they also know that David's the one that took the money. Luckily, this wasn't like a bank holdup situation. There was no guns, no other people were involved, no one was hurt or even threatened. This was just a good old-fashioned bank heist. But police and FBI had one major problem. None of the stolen bills were marked. They had all come from public circulation. There was essentially no way to trace any of the $17 million that had been stolen. There would be no way to prove which bills had come from the Loomis Fargo warehouse vault, even if they did find the money. And this was a time when security strips were just starting to be added to American currency, but nobody knows which bills, if any, had security strips in them. And it would be retired FBI agent John Wydra, I think that's how you say it, and he was the lucky dog whose desk this case landed on. The members of the heist that had stayed behind in North Carolina, Steve and his wife Michelle and Kelly, they weren't making things very hard for investigators. They weren't dropping breadcrumb trails. They were dropping whole ass loaves of bread for investigators to follow. The Loomis Fargo company was desperate for answers, so what else could they do besides offer a $500,000 reward for any information leading to the whereabouts of David Gantt, or the $500 reward could be for any information leading to the missing $17 million that had been stolen. And it took literally no time at all after this heist before Steve made his wife the queen of his double-wide trailer with the polyester curtains and the redwood deck, and I swear to God I won't do that again. Steve Chambers and his wife wasted no time when they started on their elaborate shopping sprees. They bought normal things like minivans and pool tables, and then they got a little crazy with it. They also purchased $7,000 worth of cigars that ended up being ruined, if I'm not mistaken. Like, he didn't keep the humidity in the room. I don't know. It was something about cigars, and I think they got ruined. $7,000 worth of cigars got ruined, if I'm not mistaken. They also bought tons and tons of jewelry, including a diamond ring that was worth right at $43,000. And all of this stuff was bought with cash, like $20 bills cash. Steve would even make jokes to his friends and family about the ring that Michelle was now wearing, saying things like, "I'll have to insure Michelle's arm with that rock hanging off of it." Like, their spending was not a secret. That's not all the couple was buying, though. The Chambers family had also gone from a double-wide trailer that was scarcely furnished to a 7,000 square foot house in a gated community in Kramer Mountain. Kramer Mountain is not a cheap place to live, trust me. I grew up in a trailer park right down the road from Kramer Mountain, and I'm here to tell you it ain't cheap living there. The Chambers also bought the newest and nicest furniture to go inside their new home because, obviously, their new cars, new motorcycles, and maybe one of the couple's most infamous purchases was a huge velvet picture of Elvis. And the big old velvet Elvis, as it's infamously known nowadays, is probably the most talked about thing that they bought. The Chambers couple weren't the only ones spending money, like living high on the hog either, though. Since the reward had been put out for any information about somebody spending unusual amounts of money, the Chambers family was already on the radar of the FBI as far as their new spending habits were concerned. But the guy, Eric, who had helped Steve unload the money from the Loomis Fargo truck into the moving truck, he had also been paid a pretty good chunk of money. And he had been spending his money pretty sporadically during this time as well. And since the FBI and the local police were all looking for tips and willing to pay people for tips, a tip came in about Eric Payne. And once tipsters reported that Eric had not only purchased a new Harley motorcycle, but that he'd also recently just purchased a brand spanking new Chevy Tahoe. And it's even reported that Eric had also been taking on lavish vacations recently, and he had bought all sorts of other shit that he didn't need. It was even reported that Eric Payne had bought breast implants for not only his wife, but also for his two sisters. And his wife got, a boob job and a nose job. And once FBI had Eric Payne's name, they learned that Eric worked right across the street in a building directly across from where the Loomis Fargo van with the $3 million in it had been parked and found. So there's still $14 million missing. People go where they're comfortable and where they're familiar, and even criminals do this. So it wasn't really a shock later when we learned who all was involved that, that's where they'd find the truck right across from where Eric worked. But Eric was on vacation at the time, and police would have to wait till he got back until they could talk to him and kind of, get some of their questions answered. And by this time, Steve and his wife Michelle and their kids were also living their redneck dream on Kramer Mountain in their fancy new house with their fancy new Velvet Elvis paintings, and they were really thinking the coast was clear. Even though it had only been a few months since the heist, The police were already getting tips on Eric Payne and his new spending habits. Now they're starting to get tips about the Chambers family from multiple people. The Chambers had just moved from a double-wide trailer into a gated community, and something that I think really tipped the scales in the favor for the investigators would have been about a week after the money had been stolen, when Steve's wife Michelle walked into a local bank, and she just asked the bank teller how much she could deposit into a new account, but without having to alert authorities. So she basically asked, how much money can I put in an account without you calling the feds? The bank teller's eyebrows were raised at this question, obviously, and they told her that $10,000 was the limit before they had to alert any kind of authority. So Michelle gave them about $9,500 to add to a new account. And during this transaction, Michelle even kind of winked and giggled and told the bank teller not to worry because it wasn't drug money that she was depositing. And that just raised more eyebrows. And I guess the bank didn't tell Michelle, and I'm assuming Michelle didn't know, that anytime you go into a bank and ask questions like that or make comments like that the bank teller is automatically bound to fill out those same forms and papers that Michelle had been asking about. So it really wouldn't have mattered if Michelle only opened a bank account and put $13 in it. The bank teller would have still had to fill out a form about a suspicious deposit, simply because Michelle had asked about it, and simply because she made the joke about it not being drug money. And with Steve and Michelle's job history, there was no way that they were legally and ethically making that kind of money that they were spending. The Chambers family was just paying cash for all these new big-ticket items that they were buying, and police thought that the Chambers were likely spending drug money because Steve was a known criminal. But those suspicions of drug money would soon be ruled out as highly unlikely. When people in their new gated community started asking, Steve and his wife Michelle would tell people that Steve was a retired football player for the Dallas Cowboys. And they also claimed that they owned and were selling a string of laundromats in Texas. Because people were starting to question how this family, who was just lower class last week, had gone from rags to riches so quickly. And although no one had ever heard of Steve Chambers in the football world and Google wasn't in everybody's hand in 1997, there wasn't really a way to see about the laundromats to see if it was even true. But have you ever been to a laundromat? I just don't see it bringing in millions of dollars every year. So that doesn't even make a lot of sense when you sit and think about it. And by the time the Chambers family had settled into their new house, David was having to have money either dropped off to him in person or wired to him by, like Steve or Kelly. But the money that was being dropped off was dropped off by somebody that Steve Chambers had chosen and trusted to make the drops in Mexico, and that was a man by the name of Mike McKinney. People in Mexico were starting to recognize David, though, and they were starting to recognize him as the man on the news that had stolen millions from the Loomis Fargo in North Carolina. And they were recognizing him all the way in Mexico because police made sure to run these news reports anywhere and everywhere because they knew eventually somebody would see him. David had changed his hair color and tried to make himself look different than the pictures on the news stations, but it wasn't working. It's hard to hide a redneck in Mexico, I would presume. David later says that anyone who's thinking about dyeing their hair should really read the box with the instructions on it, because when he changed his hair color, he left a massive streak down the middle of his head. But I feel like most women know to read those directions and to also not color your hair at home. Let a professional do it. So back to the guy that had been bringing money to David in Mexico, Mike McKinney. Keep that name in mind because we'll come back to him. So at this point, it's weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks after the heist, and police had leads that were starting to pile up about Steve and Michelle Chambers and Eric Payne's new spending habits. Police finally started looking into the local banks, and they found that 2 separate suspicious deposit papers had been filled out on none other than Michelle Chambers. She and Steve had not only been hella suspicious when they were opening their new flush accounts with more money than one family could ever need, but they were also opening safety deposit boxes all across the county. Some were in their names, and some were in their family members' names, and some were in their friends' names. And this is when police started doing round-the-clock surveillance on the Chambers. But police hadn't forgot about David. They were still looking into pages and calls on David's pager and his home phone, and that's when the police find tons of these 143 pages that had been sent to David's pager. And remember, those 143 messages are code for I love you. Police later find out that these messages are from Kelly Chambers. And they started looking into Kelly a little bit more, and they saw that she had been spending not a lot, but she had been spending an unusual amount of money for her lifestyle. Nothing like Steve and Michelle were spending, but she'd gotten herself like a new minivan, and she didn't really seem to be struggling to pay her bills anymore like she always had before. Police had already pieced together the fact that Kelly knew David from working with him at the Loomis Fargo warehouse. And they also knew that Kelly knew Steve Chambers. Kelly and Steve had gone to high school together, so police were off to see if Kelly could maybe help them. I don't even think the police were really suspicious of Kelly at this point. They were just thinking that maybe she would, be able to help in some way. But when police sat down to talk with Kelly, she seemed nervous. And Kelly was the only person that they had spoke to regarding this, money heist that absolutely refused to take a polygraph test. Everyone else police had talked to up to this point had agreed to take a polygraph test, but Kelly shut the entire idea down and the entire interview down, and she just kind of left abruptly. Now, police had spoken to Kelly once before, right after the heist, but they didn't really think much of that interview. She hadn't worked there in a while. But now she was seeming like a good way in to see if Kelly could somehow tie Steve and David together. Because remember, Steve and David didn't actually know each other. They'd only met once at the money swap drop-off point. David and Steve hadn't gone to school together. They didn't have mutual friends. Police and FBI probably would have never even been able to connect the two if it weren't for Kelly Campbell and, Steve and Michelle's excessive spending. Steve and Michelle ended up buying a small furniture store, and they renamed it like M&S Furniture or S&M Furniture, like something like that. They basically used their initials and made a business name out of it. And police had placed surveillance on Kelly after her awkward interview, and they'd already been surveilling Steve and Michelle Chambers. And even though Kelly swore that, yes, she and Steve had went to school together, the two had never kept in touch. And police would later be able to link Kelly's new minivan that she had recently gotten to a known acquaintance of Steve Chambers. So she's a liar. Kelly Campbell and Michelle Chambers were also seen at the Chambers' new furniture store together. So police were hot on the trail at this point. It had been a few months since the heist happened, and the only person that police knew for 100% fact was involved was David Gantt, and he hadn't been seen since, the night that he'd stolen $17 million. So even though the police were suspicious of Steve and Michelle Chambers, and now of Kelly Campbell, and they were still looking into Eric Payne, who had helped load the money, they still had to prove all of these different players were involved and connected somehow. But before Kelly could even help without realizing it, Michelle was going to help even more. Because Michelle is still making super large deposits into all of these different accounts, and she finally made a mistake. It was a big one. Michelle took some money in to add to her accounts, and when she handed the stack to the bank teller, it still had the Loomis Fargo money band wrapped around the stack of cash. The band that says like $500, $1,000, whatever they may say, it still had that band wrapped around it. So it wasn't just a Loomis Fargo band, it was a Loomis Fargo band that also had one of the initials of the employees that worked at the same Loomis Fargo warehouse that David had robbed blind. Police were able to match the handwriting and confirm that yes, this was an employee's handwriting from that Loomis Fargo, the same Loomis Fargo that David had stolen money from. And it was by pure circumstance that the employee who had initialed this money band hadn't worked inside the warehouse where the money was stored since before the heist. So there was no question about when that employee had last initialed money bands and put them back into the vault. So that was easy enough to rule out and say for sure that this was a money band that had been initialed by an employee who had not had access to any money since before the heist had taken place. There was no wondering if maybe this employee had signed their initials to the money band, maybe after the heist had happened. And this little piece of paper, this small money band, definitively linked Steve and Michelle Chambers to the heist and David Gantt. These officers weren't stupid, and they waited to make an arrest. They were hoping that one of these handful of people who they had suspected would somehow be able to link, wherever David was hiding out at. But the money band was enough for police to get a phone wiretap on Steve and Michelle Chambers' phones. And the police and FBI didn't want to just bust through the doors and scare everybody away from, keeping in touch with David. So instead of going in and searching the houses, they just wanted to listen in on their phone calls for a little bit. But the warrants that police and FBI had gotten weren't just for Steve and Michelle's home phone, though. It was good for anywhere that the FBI or police thought that they may talk about anything of importance or in relation to the Loomis Fargo heist. That would include their home phone, their phone at the furniture store that they had just bought. It would include anywhere that they thought they were talking about anything heist related. And it seems like this warrant was about to run up when finally the FBI and police heard Steve talking about hiring a bodyguard named Mike McKinney. Steve was going to pay Mike $400 a week plus pay for his apartment every month. And they had also heard Steve and Kelly Chambers talking to one another, even though Kelly had sworn that they weren't friends like that they weren't close enough to be chatting it up on the phone. There was nothing said about the heist, and police and FBI were running out of time. They could only put a wiretap on someone's phone for a certain amount of time before it becomes like a privacy issue. And time was running out. But I guess it's a good thing that police and FBI wanted to be nosy and listening in on phone calls, though, because on one phone call, Kelly tells Steve that she had just spoken to David Gantt, and boom, now they're all connected. David had sent a page or, something like that, and the FBI and police knew that David, now they know he's alive, and that Steve Chambers and Kelly Campbell had been in touch with him. Police were able to kind of decipher the way that David was letting Kelly know what payphone to be at when he would call. And at this point, it had been months since David had pulled off the heist. David called the payphone that Kelly was supposed to be at, and when it was time for the call, Kelly was a no-show. So police decided they were already there, why not answer the phone? And that's how they got David Gantt's voice on the other line. Kelly had gotten another page from David, and before she called David back, she called Steve to see what she should do, because remember, Steve likes to be in charge. And Kelly knew that David was going to be calling and he was going to be asking for more money. And police are still listening to these phone calls. So Steve finally tells Kelly that he'd had enough. It was time to have David killed, and then they wouldn't have to send him any more money, and Kelly wouldn't have to keep lying to him about meeting him in Mexico. Steve then told Kelly just to meet him at the furniture store and they'd figure it out there. So when Kelly gets to the furniture store, there's also an undercover, plainclothes FBI agent there trying to listen in and hear the plan. Steve let Kelly know that he had already had Mike McKinney in his back pocket waiting on the perfect time to kill David. And I know I'm throwing a lot of names out here, but remember, Mike McKinney is the guy that had been personally dropping off the money to David in Mexico. There was only one problem with this little plan that Steve had, though. The whole gang knew that David was in Mexico, but they didn't know where in Mexico he was. Steve told Kelly to tell David that someone was bringing him more money because David trusted Kelly for some unknown reason, and he would trust her enough to tell him where he was hiding out at. So, he would need to tell her where he was at so they could have money dropped off to him. So on a tapped phone line, David told Kelly that he was hiding out in Cozumel, Mexico. David had actually used Mike McKinney's ID to enter Mexico, and now McKinney's the one trying to carry out a hit on David's life at Steve Chambers' direction. And even though Kelly knew about the hit that was out on David, she never spoke a word about it to him. She never warned him, to watch his back. She never gave him a heads up. She never said a word. Mike McKinney had already made his way onto the police's radar before this murder-for-hire plot, too, though. McKinney had already been heard on a phone call with Steve Chambers about, him being hired as Steve's bodyguard. So the FBI had already been watching Mike McKinney, too. Steve ordered Mike McKinney to take a few other guys with him to Mexico, and that they would kill David, and that would be the end of that. So 5 months after the heist happened, the FBI and the police had to be on their A-game. They had to not only save David from a murder-for-hire plot, they also had to be able to charge him for the $17 million that he'd stolen. FBI made their way to Mexico, hoping to find David before Mike McKinney and the other guys that Steve Chambers had paid and hired to kill David. And as soon as agents approached David in Mexico, David asked if he was an FBI agent. When the agent answered that yes, he was, David told him that he really needed to talk because apparently David had a pretty good idea of what the plan was that Steve had made for him. He kind of had a feeling that Steve was going to try to have him killed. And it had gotten harder and harder for David to get in touch with Steve and Kelly. And they'd slowly stopped sending him money and checking in on him like they had been. David figured it would probably be easier for Steve and Kelly if he were dead and out of the picture. After this, David Gantt was finally arrested and brought back to North Carolina. And since David knew, the gig was up, he just kind of walked the FBI agents through how he had stolen the money. And during this flight from Mexico back to North Carolina, one of the agents asked David what it was about Kelly that would make him do something like this. And David answered with, quote, "Believe it or not, I only kissed her once. I guess that turned out to be a pretty expensive kiss." And I know I keep harping on it, but David had no criminal background, nothing on his record before this. So, I don't see another reason he would do this. Back in North Carolina, Steve and Michelle Chambers, Kelly Campbell, Eric Payne, and Mike McKinney, and some other guy named Scott Grant. He had kind of been brought in to help unload the money too. All of these people were arrested. And out of all of these arrests that were made, Steve Chambers was the first one that sang like a fucking canary when he was arrested. Police, of course, went through and bagged and tagged anything that they suspected was bought with the stolen Loomis Fargo money at everybody's house. There ended up being 21 different people arrested in this case that were somehow in one way or another linked to the Loomis Fargo heist. Whether it was before, during, or after, they were able to arrest 21 people. Steve Chambers' attorney was even arrested for money laundering. And Steve's attorney was the only person out of all 21 people that pled not guilty to all the crimes he was charged with. Literally every single other person pled guilty, which I guess it would be kind of hard to deny or hide this case and the evidence that came with it. The FBI had recovered more than $10 million from dozens of safety deposit boxes that Steve and Michelle Chambers had gotten their friends and family to open for them. The FBI also took more than $1 million in cash from some of these people's personal houses where they lived with their families. And $720,000 in cold hard cash was found inside of the Chambers house, along with tons and tons of other different items that had clearly been bought with the stolen money. None of the people arrested in relation to the heist had enough of their own money to hire an attorney. All 21 defendants had to have public defenders represent them in court. Which, the irony. David Gantt was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison. Steve Chambers was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in prison. Steve's wife, Michelle Chambers, was sentenced to 7 years and 8 months in prison. Kelly Campbell was sentenced to 5 years and 10 months in prison. And Eric Payne was sentenced to 6.5 years in prison. Mike McKinney got the longest sentence, which, of course, murder for hire, you're going to get more. Mike McKinney was sentenced to 11 years and 6 months in prison. David is out of prison now, and he's living his normal lower to middle class lifestyle in Florida. And there's still to this day more than $2 million missing from this Loomis Fargo heist that's never been found. When David Gantt was younger and still serving his time in prison, somebody asked him if he could go back, would he do it again? His answer was simple. He said that he would do it again because that heist was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that he would never get the chance to do again. Now that he's older, David says that he's more embarrassed than anything else about the heist and his actions. And that is all I have this week. Also, I think I messed up and said that the heist happened on a Sunday, but it was definitely on a Saturday. That was just my mistake. I even typed it in my notes that said Saturday, so I'm not sure why I saw and read Sunday. But I wanted to make that correction. And I am running out of time in my little she shed by myself. The kids are home. Dinner's not started. So, on that note, let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.